thank goodness it's the weekend, right? Because what a week it was. In fact, one of the wackiest days I remember in a while, Brian, started with this hangover, if you will, from Powell's hawkish press conference, because he didn't know what was going to happen on Friday.
That's right.
And then we went into, the Fed rate cuts. And then lastly, of course, were all of the tariffs that came out on Thursday. And so the market was all over the place, didn't know what to do with all this information. So let's try to rip it apart. And really, let's start with the Fed, who made all this hawkish statements on Thursday, and then we got a jobs report on Friday.
That's right. So when we look at what the Fed did, this is almost replaying what happened in 2024. And so kind of we go in the Wayback Machine to July of 2024. That's before they started the aggressive rate cutting path that they were on, right? So in July, they're like, hey, we're going to stay on pause. Suddenly, a week later, they got a jobs number that was worse than expected. So at their September meeting, they did a catch-up cut. So they did a total of 50 basis points instead of 25. Right. Seems like that's how things are playing out now. And on Wednesday, Chair Powell, when he was doing his press conference, he was touting the strength of the labor market, saying things look like they're really in balance, it's really solid. Well, lo and behold, it wasn't as solid as I thought.
Right. And so Friday morning came out, and there were some glaring holes. I guess, it depends on how you want to look at the facts, and I'm being honest about that, is you can say there is strength in the economy because average hourly work went up, and there is some positive parts of that. But in general, if you read it from 30,000 feet, it was not a great jobs report.
No, well, in a weird way, it was actually better than the jobs reports that we had in May and June. It's just we didn't know it at the time, because along with the monthly report that comes out, they always revise the previous 2 months as well, because the surveys that they do, they take a while to come in and process, and comes to find out that the labor market wasn't as strong in May and June as originally thought. And so we actually had an acceleration in private sector payrolls, which was a good thing to see. So, maybe the worst is behind us in terms of the labor market slowdown. It's just, it is a little, I think, embarrassing for the Fed, where if they're going to say that the labor market is strong as it is, ignore certain signals that there were a few little cracks forming, and then all of a sudden, less than 48 hours later, to have data come out to refute that.
And, we talk about Powell, and, everyone's kind of throwing a lot of shade at the guy, but he risks making the same errors he did in not only 2014 but 2018, and waiting for inflation to develop, and it never happens. And that's the same thing they're talking about with tariffs. They're saying this tariff will be inflationary. Okay, logically that makes sense. It just hasn't happened. And really what we're seeing right now, Danny called it a mutiny, but I don't know if it's a mutiny, but two Fed chair people went against him.
And then on CNBC and Bloomberg on Friday, after the jobs report came out, a few of the other Fed officials, they're like, well, maybe we're changing our minds here to align with what Chris Waller and Michelle Bowman, they said.
And
they were the ones
who
who dissented. And that's the first time since 1993 that you had two governors dissent from the opinion. And back in 1993, the dissenters were the ones who were right about what the change in policy probably should have been.
Well, I was going to say, I got a couple of dissenters here in the studio with me, but then it means that you guys are right, so I'm not going to say that. But so we have this, that these Fed chair people are going against what Powell is doing. But, what's interesting is there's kind of a betting market, the poly market, and you can look at it, and now it's spiked all the way up to about 70 to 80% that there will be a rate cut in February, and I find that interesting. But I ran into some people yesterday, and they said, why is that so important that rates go down? Because to me, this person said, quarter point is not going to change my life. So I think that was a pretty good perception.
Yeah, it's true. You look at it, it's like, that's like a rounding error. But it's really important, not necessarily because of the dollar amount or the percentage point, but what does it do in terms of the general availability of credit in the economy? So it's not necessarily the federal funds rate, which is this overnight borrowing rate. That's what the Fed targets. And it's only really relevant to the big banks that borrow at it. But it signals that the Fed is trying to expand the availability of credit in the overall economy. And so you could actually see an outsized move in the interest rates that are more relevant to you and me and everybody else, like mortgage rates, car loan rates, credit card rates. And so I think that's really why 25 basis points, it might seem like a very small step, but it can have a big effect especially if you consider that it could signal a change in the path for rates.
Yeah, it's a change in the path. Folks, it's reasonable to expect that, maybe stocks are expensive or that earnings won't be as good because of tariffs or even perhaps, for example, not getting anywhere with Ukraine. All of that could upset the market. And August generally is a rough month. So obviously, folks, if you're listening to this, this is a time to make sure that your plan is aligned with your goals.